The idea is that I'm sending out ideas and thoughts and reflections, quite a lot of it born from my nearly 40 years experience as an astrologer now, and hoping that this can be my offering to the future and that it'll be inspiring to students coming up. So that's the whole idea behind it. But it really is mercurial. We might not have time to look through the contents tonight, but if you've got the contents there, and it'll give you a pretty good idea of the scope and the breadth of topics that I cover.
Okay. There were some topics that I'm particularly interested in, and which you cover, you know, broadly. The first thing that I just wanted to ask you was astrology. This is a broad sweep of many years that you've been writing, and you've been looking at astrology and being analytical and critical of astrology, as well as a cheerleader for it. So it's not all saying astrology, you know, not all your articles are saying astrologers are marvelous people and astrology is fantastic and everybody needs to do this. You're quite a critical or skeptical witness to astrology. And I wanted to ask you, because you've been writing for so many magazines for so many years, how has astrology changed? Or what's the biggest thing that you can see over that 25 years?
The most obvious thing, of course, is that, you know, I'm sure everyone here could tell you this as well as me, is the computer revolution of the last few decades, because that has completely transformed our world, and it's certainly transformed astrology. I've been writing a column. Christina said to me, I want to be looking at the broad sweep of astrology in your time writing about it. And the end result of that was my next column in the Astrological Journal, which I've just written this afternoon. But what I did was I decided, thinking about this broad sweep thing, to see if I could find the first ever thing I had written on astrology. And I did manage to track it down, and it was for the Astrological Association Summer School, which I attended in 1987. And it was called On Being and Becoming an Astrologer. And I'll just give you a little quote from it. It's titled On Being and Becoming an Astrologer. This year's summer school offered a varied range of experience from interpersonal contemplation to consideration of the likely general election result. And then I reproduced this as a celebration issue in the Astrological Journal, 60-year celebrations of the Astrological Association's founding. And I said in 2018, it made me smile to read what I had written rather tentatively about computers and astrology in that 1987 report. As I said in 2018, few of us on that course had the slightest clue that astrologers, like everyone else, were merely tapping on a door, which would shortly swing open to reveal an entirely new landscape of global interconnectedness, which, for both good and ill, has already drawn in much of the population of planet Earth. So it was really quite interesting reading that early piece of writing and my reflections on having republished it 35 years later.
Yeah, yeah. So just in a nutshell, what's the positive and what's the negative of the computer revolution?
Well, that is
such, in 2 words, 2 sentences.
That's such a huge question. Is this fair to ask me this? Well, the biggest positive, of course, is that, in fact, I'm going to read you another bit of this because I sort of sum it up quite neatly. Where are they? Yes, what I've said, from typewriting to computing. So the broad sweep of astrology in my time of writing about it has taken me from sitting, bashing out notes and reports from hand-drawn horoscopes on my old brother manual typewriter, all the way to using highly sophisticated computer programs, which will quite simply do everything we need to do as astrologers. From instant push-a-button birth charts to all varieties of prognosticatory options, both technical and interpretive, anyone from the very green amateur to the sophisticated professional can have any kind of software they wish, dependent on their finances and predilections. And the point I made later on was that at one level, this total availability is a brilliant thing. At another level, it's got a very dark shadow side. And it's like everything that comes into the human scope, everything has got a very plus side and a very minus side. And the computer revolution is no exception. Because I have done, my first qualification was through the Faculty of Astrological Studies in the 1980s. And then I spent the whole of the 1990s studying with Liz Green, which involved me in flying up and down from Scotland once a month for years. And I eventually got my diploma. But my work has been in supervision ever since then. My ethics, I like to think, are really, really strong. And I am a trained and experienced counselor, therapist, and teacher. So I bring all that to my practice. And I feel very strongly that astrology has so much power in it that we need to be respectful both of ourselves and our clients in the way we handle that power. And I think that the computer revolution has created a lack of discrimination, and it's created a whole stack of people who can just press a button and call themselves astrologers with very, very little grounding and very little Saturn involved in it. And I find that quite disturbing and quite troubling. And I don't know what we do about it, because on the one hand, it's fantastic that young people have got this access to all this knowledge. And there really does seem to be, astrology seems to be having a moment, and there seems to be a great deal of interest in astrology in an open-minded way amongst the younger generations. But it's not a good thing to abandon the 10,000 hours that are required in order to really become a proficient practitioner of any of the arts and crafts. Because in pursuing these 10,000 hours, you straighten out your ethics, you straighten out all sorts of things that you just can't do in 5 minutes by pressing a button.
Which brings me to the other thing that you write quite a lot about in this. There are quite a few pieces about this, which is what is it? What's an astrologer for? What does an astrologer do? And I want to quote you back to yourself.
Okay.
From page 84.
Oh, page 84. I think I better look up and try and remember what I said on page 84.
What you said is, I think that effective astrologers in consultation are poised on the interface between fate and free will. On the one hand, helping clients to confirm who they are, which they probably already know if they're honest with themselves. But on the other hand, helping them to see and to broaden the range of possible expression of the energies with which they've been born. And then you go on to say, Can
I quote the next bit?
Yeah,
the astrologer's ego should have a minimal influence on the process of reading another person's horoscope. It's impossible to keep ego completely out of it. It's impossible to be completely objective, to avoid making mistakes. But what the person takes away should be as much theirs and as little the astrologer's as is possible.
And do you think that is doable?
Yes.
Yeah. And I know also that that in that same piece that you're talking about how you're really interested in working with clients who are already on a journey of self-discovery and who are open to change, is what you want to say.
Yeah. Yes, and I also think that, I mean, certainly one of the big changes, I took a 12-year break because I was having a long Neptune transit at the beginning of the 2000s. And I basically, Neptune was opposing all my 6 Leo planets in the 12th house from the 6th house. And we had a big family crisis. I was at the beginning of the menopause, and my energy just collapsed, and I had to really take time out. And I found that astrology had utterly changed in the way we went about our business in those 12 years. Because to come back to your point, I used to send out a leaflet which had clearly stated my background, my qualifications, my training, my experience, the kind of astrology I did. And if somebody phoned me up and said, I'd like to have a reading, I'd say, that's great. Give me your address. I'll send you out my leaflet. And if you're still interested after you read that, get back to me. Of course, I came back and discovered that that was completely redundant. So I had to get even more computer literate than I already was, put up a page, etc., etc., put my credentials out on the web. So that was really very, very different from what I had been used to. And I rather like that, actually. I think it's important for older astrologers like me. I mean, you're a good bit younger than me, Christina, to try and go with the flow of things and not become dinosaurs and not go, oh, I don't like this, I don't like that. And the dreadful phrase, in my day. I think if anyone ever hears me uttering that phrase, could they please come over from where they are and drag me away with a gag on my mouth? Because I think we have to move with the times. But I think we also, because we have a breadth of and length of perspective, I think it's up to people like me to offer some kind of constructive criticism as well. And I really think that we need a lot more Saturn and a lot more grounding than we actually have across the piece in the astrological world at present.
You know, I mean, I think that there's a problem the other way as well. I think there's overly Saturnian astrology too.
Well, I'm certainly sounding very Saturnian at the moment.
Because I think that there's this whole idea that we have to go back to the original texts and we can only use something that was written in the 4th century. There's that whole strand of astrology as well at the moment. Very Saturnian. And it's maybe a counter to this fluffy stuff that you're talking about. But there's a way in between, which is to stay grounded and as you said, Saturnian.
We have to find a middle ground. And I mean, I know some wonderful young astrologers and astrology students. I work as a mentor. I mentor students in different parts of the world. And I'm also a mentor for the MISPA International School of Psychological Astrology. And I think that the generations coming up, there's a lot of brilliant people in there. But there is an awful lot of dross out there too. And I really don't quite know what we do about that. I mean, my own response to it is to be a committed and good and ethical and compassionate practitioner, and to not be too judgmental of other people's approaches if I can possibly avoid it, because, you know, it's a big, broad church. I think we could, at this moment, given all the division and darkness there is in the world, I think astrologers could be kinder to one another than they are. And I think that the different factions could actually look at one another and see what each has to offer that enriches the totality of the world of astrology. And I think there's a bit too much factionalism. And
I love the idea of astrological factions. We're such a sort of flaky, like peacenik bunch, that the idea of these astrologers kind of fighting seems sort of kind of wimpy.
Yes, but it happens like every human group and every human community.
It does. But I want to move back to the book.
Okay.
And talk about fate and what you think about fate, because you've written quite a lot in here about fate. And I found that also very interesting. One of the things that I would say about this book, which has got lots of different individual essays, it's a collection of essays essentially,
and
columns, but really essays, is that it stimulates thought, it stimulates ideas about different aspects of the craft, and also about transits and what's happening in the cosmos. So it's a very stimulating book. It's also very well written, right? So it's not turgid, you know. It's not, who's that guy, Dane Rudger? This is the opposite. This is really easy reading, but it does stimulate ideas. And this is why I'm bringing up some of these ideas that I found interesting in here, which is one of these is about astrologers. What's the point of being an astrologer? And another thing that comes up repeatedly when you're talking, or when you're writing rather, is fate and how you see fate and free will. I'm looking at this essay called Prediction and a Personal Story.
Oh, yes.
Which,
what page is that on, Christina? Perhaps you can point me to the
122. You say, I'm personally very hesitant about the accuracy and the wisdom of predicting at all, especially for individuals, and any more than a describing the core and speculating about the branches kind of way. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about your attitude towards fate and free will, and how you see us as, how you think that works.
Well, none of us has ever sorted out what the balance exactly is between fate and free will. And I don't think any of us ever will. But I remember very clearly in a Liz Green seminar sometime in the 1990s, Liz saying to us, I think she had not long written The Astrology of Fate at that time. She said, you know, we 20th century people aren't as free as we like to think we are. That was the gist of what she said. And my own feeling is that when, as an astrologer in consultation, when I'm looking at somebody's birth chart, my impression over decades of practice is that people, the more aware people are, the more conscious they are of their motivations, their inner and outer actions and their impact on other people, the more reflective they are and the more they're willing to own up to all the different contradictory dimensions of themselves, the more personal freedom they are likely to have.
Mm.
And that's been my credo in my own personal life, because there's nothing I have done or worked with clients that hasn't flown from my own values and from my own experience. So I think that we can negotiate with the fates up to a point which we will never find out exactly what the boundary is. But beyond that, there is a kind of ananke, the Greek word for necessity. And I think I'm probably far enough on from a recent experience I've had to be able to tell you it, because I was presented with a very harsh indication that there is fate in our lives. My husband, my dear husband Ian, took a major stroke on the 12th of January 2020 and died the next day. Now, the 12th of January 2020 was the exact day of the beginning of the new Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn. Now, the thing is, I was born under an exact Saturn-Pluto conjunct nearly all my personal planets in 1947. And my whole life has been governed by the different challenges that combination has brought us. It's made its squares, its oppositions, its waning squares, and its conjunctions. So I was born under a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Leo. So the first conjunction was ruled by the sun. I married Ian under the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Libra in 1982. So the second conjunction of my life was ruled by Venus. And then 3 hours into the third conjunction in my life, which is ruled by Saturn, my husband died, just like that. And I was stunned by his death, but B, I was stunned by the feeling of fate that came with it. It really felt as though we had been allocated by the fates a certain amount of time to be together from 1982 to the beginning of 2020, and that was it. No negotiation.
Mm.
So that's I have actually written about Ian's death in the context, but I've never written about the fate, what I've just told you. I've never written about that. But that really, really struck me. Now, this is coming from somebody who really does believe that we live in a universe with a certain amount of fluidity in it, that basically astrology is about energy patterns. We are a little discrete DISCRETE package of energy, and we're moving through an ongoing, unfolding, changing energy field all the time. And when the patterns up there hit our pattern, then that generates a particular set of energies that bring certain experiences our way. So really, my attitude to astrology is that it's basically, and I know that Brian Cox and what's his name, the other guy who hates astrology without knowing anything about it.
I can't remember his name. It's erased from my mind.
If I said this to them, they would both foam at the mouth and collapse on the ground, writhing with rage. But I actually see astrology as a form of quantum physics, really. except that we choose to interpret these patterns from observations going back 6,000 years. We have 6,000 years of observational evidence, and we interpret these patterns of energy from that perspective and from what we bring in terms of the culture we are living through at the time and the values of that culture, which shape everything everybody thinks and does, whether we realize it or not. So that's some of my take on fate. I don't know if I should tell the laundrette story. Should I?
I think you should. I mean, yes, of course you should. Tell the laundrette story. And this is actually back to, because I was actually coming to that. There's an essay about vocation, you know, the idea of vocation. I think that it's in there under the vocational essay.
Probably.
Just really interesting because, of course, people are, it's one of the main things that people come to talk to an astrologer about is, you know, what am I doing? You know, what's my vocation? And your story about the laundrette fits in with this idea of fate, but also of, you know, it's interesting in terms of vocation as well. So
yeah. Well, once upon a time when I was 27 and fancied myself as a young Marxist, so I was lecturing in English at the time, and I was not at all receptive to anything symbolic or mystical at all. I was a classic astrology dismisser, knew nothing about it, but thought it was a load of rubbish. So in that kind of mode, I ran into a rather strange looking couple in a laundrette with their little girl. I became friendly with their little girl. She put my money into the laundrette, into the machine for me, and they said, oh, come to our house, which was just along the road where I lived in Bath in Somerset, and have a cup of tea with us. And on the road, and astrologers. And I thought, oh no, astrologers, oh no, what have I got myself mixed up with? But because I was a well brought up, polite Hebridean woman, I thought, well, I'll go along with this. So we went into their house, the tea was made. The guy was Irish, his name was Elias, I remember. And he was so charming, and so slain was I by his charm that when he said, I'm going to do your horoscope, give me your birth time, I meekly, which is not like me at all, gave him the information. They produced all kinds of bits of paper and books and drew this thing up, the freehand drawing of which is in this book somewhere, and completely knocked the socks off me. Because he looked at this chart and he said, well, he said, you're coming up to your Saturn return. There's things about yourself you've probably not faced, so I'm going to line them all up for you. So you know how we all try to live through the bits of ourselves that the world will like, and we keep all the dark stuff out of the way? Well, he laid all that in front of me. And he described he did it very sympathetically, actually. He described my father, who was quite a wayward, eccentric, interesting character, very clearly. He described my mother. He described my various career strands, some of which I had and others I had still to meet. And he said, he looked at this and he said, well, he said, you may describe yourself as a Marxist skeptic now, but you're not. You've got a very strong spiritual and mystical side. And if you don't do something with this, you're never going to be happy. And what's more, in another about 7 years, and what I didn't know then was he was looking at Uranus coming up to my Scorpio IC and South Node, you are going to end up either doing this or something very like it.
Yeah.
So I staggered off out of his house, feeling as though I'd been hit over the head with a sock full of sand and going, how could they do that from marks on a piece of paper?
Yeah. And that's Uranus as the awakener.
But then I sort of forgot about it because obviously the universe must have judged that I wasn't remotely ready to embark on this. But 7 years later, a friend who I respected handed me this book, which was called, it was by Alan Oken, and it was called The Astrologer, The Road and Its Travelers. And he said, I think you would like this. And I thought, what? Okay, I'll go and read it. And honestly, I read about a page, and it was like somebody reaching out of the book and going, you're for me. And that was it. 7 years later, I started studying astrology, told nobody, decided I would do an investigation on the basis of, and find out whether there was anything in astrology on the basis of intelligent and study rather than dismissal. And of course, that was me gradually becoming an astrologer for the rest of my life. So
That was
Whether
fate.
whether we should predict or not, there's no doubt that astrologers sometimes get it absolutely bang on.
Yeah. Like I mean, I will probably end with that, actually, because I want to come back to the future, you know, talking about the Back to the Future in a minute, towards the end of this. I wanted to mention, Marion said a couple of interesting, I like what Marion has said, is fate spawns freedom by acceptance, which I think is right. Fate spawns freedom by acceptance. You accept fate to a certain extent, and then that is actually quite liberating. And that's one of the things that astrology gives us, isn't it? Is that you know yourself, and it's liberating to know yourself and think, well, actually, I'm always going to have that Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius that makes me talk, you know, I'm gonna be like that.
Yeah.
It's,
And
it's okay.
the best of
The other thing that Marion said that I thought, I mean, we've kind of moved on from that. It is interesting that the return to the old is the major emphasis of some astrologers in the US, which does which submerges and suppresses the emotional depth of astrology. And I think that's really a really valid and interesting point as well, is how when one becomes, and I would put it in I would recast that and say, when you become too Saturnian with astrology, what it does is it takes out that emotional content, and therefore it's, you know, it loses some value, actually.
I would entirely agree. I mean, I have a very rational, skeptical side to my nature, of course, so that's Saturn, Pluto, Mercury, but it's squared by Jupiter, sextile by Neptune, and it's all in the 12th house.
Yeah.
Which of course opens me up to the great universal. And I am so aware of the science has given us a kind of gift without meaning to, because I don't know if you've come across the idea that science thinks and believes that we operate within a 4% band of what they think the total of reality is. That's the material world that we live in. And the 96% we know is there, but we don't know what it is. So to leave all that richness out, where everything that enriches life, like love and symbolism and imagination and music, to leave all that out, leaves out most of the richness of the human condition.
Yeah.
But there seems to be this Saturnian reductionist need to squash things flat. And I think it comes from fear. I think it comes from fear of the unknown. Liz Green did a wonderful talk a number of years ago at an AA conference called The Astrologer and the Skeptic. And the point she made was that the astrology dismissers, because the word skeptic has been sort of annexed to dismissal, which I think is a shame.
Can I interject and say that there's a good piece in here about that?
Yeah. Well, Liz Green makes the point that the people who are dismissing astrology are coming from fear. And astrologers are also coming from fear of the unknown and from fear that life might be meaningless, because that's what got me studying astrology. I didn't want to have to believe that life was meaningless. And the great gift that astrology gave to me is that it showed me that we live in a meaningful field. We live a meaningful life. We may not understand the totality of it, but there's no doubt that we live in a meaningful life. Anyway.
And on that note, sorry, I'm making you talk a lot.
It's all
but it's because there's so many topics that you discuss in this book that are interesting. And obviously, I mean, this is sort of, we should be advertising it and saying it's on Amazon. You can buy it.
Sure. You can even buy it in Japan. I've got messages from all over the place saying, I got your book in Japan, I got it in Brazil, I got it here, I got it there, which is really nice.
Very nice. But I wanted to talk, I really enjoyed the piece that you wrote about Chiron going into Aries. Actually, it's quite a wide-ranging piece.
It is, really.
So it's not really just about Chiron going into Aries, it's about Chiron in general. And you have, I think, quite profound thoughts about the cycle of Chiron and what it means, and both from your own experience and from having seen a lot of clients. And actually, it's not completely what maybe most astrologers would say about Chiron, I don't think.
Well, I see Chiron. There's a quite a sort of maverick astrologer called A.L. Morrison, who described Chiron as the inconvenient benefic. And I actually think it's very important to remember that dimension of Chiron, because if you think about it, the symbol for Chiron is the key. Chiron unlocks the barriers of Saturn. Chiron appeared between the orbits of Saturn and Uranus. So Chiron unlocks the limitations of Saturn and opens us up to the wider and more unusual and unexpected perspectives of Uranus. It has that dimension. So I can tell you a story about that, which involves that dimension as well as the healing dimension. My lovely late husband Ian has got a Gemini midheaven, and when Chiron hit his midheaven in I was 40 and he was 44, so it was 1987, I think, when Chiron hit his midheaven. He was a devoted smoker. He used to roll his own cigarettes, and I smoked at that time as well. He got mumps, really bad mumps in his throat. And he stopped smoking for 3 days because he couldn't smoke. It was too sore. I had to liquidize his food and feed it to him in a straw. It was pathetic, really. And then in day 4, I saw his hand sneaking over to the tobacco pouch. And I said, Ian, you've been off the cigarettes for 3 days. If you can stay off them, this was about February, I'll stay off. I will keep smoking until Easter, and then I will stop at Easter and I'll be reborn as a smoker if you can just stay off them now. So he stayed off the cigarettes when he was then and never went back. And he had Chiron on his midheaven. So to me, that was a combination of the inconvenient benefic and the healing impact of Chiron.
Yeah.
Which was lovely. And there's another, should I tell another Chiron story, which is about the Chiron return?
Yeah, I think people really need to hear more about real Chiron stories rather than the kind of fantasy that is around Chiron.
Yeah. Well, the most striking thing that I remember from my practice, which was very, very moving, I'm very interested in the Chiron return because when Chiron comes back to its natal position, it triggers off all the aspects that were present when you were born, which are connected to Chiron. So very often it brings back old pain, old issues to be looked at again, experiences that have echoes of the past. And this is what this story is about. I had a woman come in for a consultation and she had just crossed 50. I think she was about 51. And she had just had her Chiron return, and Chiron was, I think, opposite the moon and square Saturn in her horoscope. So clearly her Chiron return was going to involve some kind of loss or difficulty of a profound nature connected to a mother figure or a female figure. And it would have caused her quite a lot of pain. And she said, oh yes, she said, my mother-in-law died when I was just over 50. And then I said to her, the key bit of the whole thing was I said to her, was there by any chance an event in the first year of your life which has echoes of what's happening now? And she said, yes, my mother died when I was 1. And it was like opening up something for her that had been really difficult, because the reason she'd come for a consultation was because she couldn't understand why she was going through such terrible grief for her mother-in-law. She loved her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law had been like a mother to her, but she still thought that she was grieving too much. And when we opened up the astrology and took it right back to the link between her mother-in-law's death and her mother's death, it was like you could actually see the light going on behind her eyes. And she said, I now understand why my grief is so devastating. I could never grieve for my mother. I was too young. So at that point, I was able to refer her to a psychotherapist who I knew and trusted, because one of the things I think astrologers should always do is have a range of other therapists to whom they can refer clients, because we're always going to encounter things that are beyond our competence, and we should be humble and honest about acknowledging that. and having the right people to send clients to. So I passed this lady on to a psychotherapist I know. And that was a really powerful session for both of us. I was very, very moved by it. And I really did feel that the astrology had opened up something for her that probably nothing else could have done.
Yeah, and not so quickly either.
Oh.
You know, that's 10 sessions of therapy to get there.
Yeah, at least.
Whereas astrology is right to the point, which is why when we talk about that's why psychological astrology is so important. That's what it's about. I want to go back to this quitting smoking.
Okay.
There's another part to that, which I also thought was something that we talk about, is this idea of moon dark. And how useful that time of the month is. Again, not so much in the way people might think. It's not necessarily about the new moon is not always about planting new seeds. The moon dark is the dark of the moon. But you have you quit smoking, and I found that also really an amazing story about how you really quit smoking, because it's to do with your husband's Chiron on the MC, but there's another part to that.
Okay. In 1987, in March, I think it was March, end of March, I went down to London to sit with Alan Oaken, who was doing a 3-day event on metaphysical astrology. And off I go down. I was staying in my in-laws' empty flat, empty apart from their very vicious, nasty old cat called Taju, who features in this story. So off I go to the Alan Oaken weekend, and he could have given us a lot of handouts, and we could have read a lot of stuff in advance, because an awful lot of it was just going over material that, we could have had in advance. But apart from that, it was a very useful weekend. And at the end of it, now I am really not very visual at all. At least I didn't used to be. I'm very wordy. So he decided at the end that since there was about to be, so we were just on the edge of moon dark, there was about to be a new moon solar eclipse in Aries, slight difference there. He was going to do a guided meditation through this eclipse at the time of the eclipse. And what we were to do, since it was Aries, was we were to think about letting go of something that we wanted to free ourselves from. So I thought, oh gosh, I was tired by this time. I had brain strain. I'd had enough. I'm quite, as will come through the book, I'm quite skeptical and open-minded sort of way. I thought, oh, can't be bothered doing this. However, being polite, I thought, right, I'm just going to do it. So he got us to shut our eyes, and he guided us through this meditation. I shut my eyes, didn't expect anything to happen. And as he was speaking, waves of color, just like the Northern Lights, started to happen behind my eyes. Waves of color, all sorts of jewel colors. And I just sat there and listened to this meditation, and he talked us through it and then brought us out of it. And I sat there thinking, wow, you were entirely wrong about this kind of thing. This has been a real experience. And I thought, okay, this eclipse is opposite my Neptune. So why don't I give up smoking right now? So I got my cigarettes, went out for the break, threw my packet of cigarettes into a bin and thought, that's it, cracked it. Except that at 3 o'clock in the morning, headachy, jittery, grumpy, pursued around the flat by the horrid Taju who hated my presence, I went out into rainy London and bought a packet of cigarettes and came back smoking 2 of them on the way back. And Taju went for me when I got in, and I said, Taju, don't ever meditate on an eclipse. So, however, 2 weeks later, new moon, full moon, 2 weeks later was Easter Friday. And I said to Ian, okay, I'm going to give up smoking today. I'm going to die as a smoker and be reborn as a non-smoker on Easter Monday. And lo and behold, I have never smoked since.
So there. I think that's quite powerful.
Believe it if you like.
It worked. I have a question, a sort of dumb question about that. Tadju, is he named after the boy in Death in Venice?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, my relatives lived in Hampstead, my dear.
Yeah,
So
I was just
else would their cat be called but something like Tadju?
a very beautiful boy cat.
Well, he was really a deeply unattractive old harridan by the time I got there, but maybe he was beautiful in his youth. I don't know, but he and I just loathed each other on sight. It was quite amazing, really. Okay.
Yeah.
Any more questions? I'm just warming up now.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions they want to sort of say? Just unmute yourself and ask while I look through here, because I have a load more things we can talk through. Having made notes on. Oh, I just want to quote Anne, actually, because I found this kind of hilarious and also true. This is on page 201, and if you're interested. The writer Ernest Hemingway once memorably observed that all writers need a built-in shock-proof crap detector. Those of us who inhabit the other worlds of palmistry, I Ching, tarot, astrology, politics, exclamation mark, etc., also need one of those, in my opinion. An opening gambit of mine during the years of teaching astrology to beginners in classes was usually this: don't necessarily believe a word I say, exciting, interesting, and persuasive though it might sound. Always test it out in your own experience. Okay, and someone does have a question here, which I think is interesting because it's back to the first question at the beginning.
Katie, that's a very good question. Yes, I would say there absolutely is a big difference. And having said that, I mean, I am so grateful that being able to press a button on a computer liberated me from all that really hateful maths that one had to do in order to calculate a chart by hand. So, that's my opening statement. However, there is something about the slow, patient labor of doing the calculations and gradually finding out where the sun is, where the moon is. So that's the ascendant. Oh, the node's down there. So that by the time you have calculated everything and written it all down meticulously in your sheet, you already have a sense of the person whose chart it is, and you're already beginning to feel a connection with them. So, and by the time you've actually drawn the chart, although I didn't like doing the maths, I did actually manage to get myself a distinction in my calculation paper in my certificate, because I was so determined that I wasn't going to let it beat me. But I didn't like it. I used to have to work myself up into a frenzy of sub-hysteria to be able to teach calculation to my students, which used to make them laugh. But I just didn't enjoy it. And I must tell you a story before I carry on with this. One time I was really at the end of my tether, having spent a whole evening teaching calculation. And at the very end of the class, this student who had a Uranus-Pluto conjunction, so one of the amazing Uranus-Pluto generation, her Uranus-Pluto conjunction fell on my ascendant. And she said, now, if I was in the middle of Russia and the international dateline or something passed through my village, and my mother lived on one side, my father lived on the other, how would we work out the time zone? And my head just about exploded at that point. It was just sheer torture. I don't think I answered it in that particular class. But anyway, there's a beauty in drawing up a hand-drawn chart and in taking these numbers and putting them as artistically as you can, given possibly your limitations as an artist, and then seeing the final article and signing your name to it and the date to it. I used to really love doing that. And I had a fancy stamp that I used to put on. I mean, I don't have 6 planets in Leo for nothing. And
I would say it's Virgo rising as well.
Yeah, Virgo rising, all that stuff in Leo in the 12th house. You try hammering that lot into shape over a lifetime and see how long it takes you. But anyway, I used to just love that moment of looking at the complete chart, It always took me nearly an hour because I'm not fast. I'm very slow spatially. But you had a real sense of connection to the person, and that you cannot get from pressing a button.
On the other hand,
it's fantastic.
Yeah.
You get all these different chart forms and fancy forms and this forms and that forms and charts with asteroids. Christina has turned me on to asteroids. I'm trying to persuade her to get a book out on asteroids. So you can do anything with computer charts. So they're fab. They're absolutely wonderful. But that experience you cannot capture except by doing it laboriously by hand.
Hey, I think Peg wants to say something.
Oh, Peg. Right. I thought I remembered it was Peg from our.
It is. Peg. So I also, when I learned it in London in '79, I came home to Madison. I'd have my cup of coffee, my table of houses, and sit by the lake and, you know, do this ritual thing, which was really fun. But I wanted to add that computers are not always accurate. So I have, now that I do them by computer, I double check. So I have time passages on my phone, and for a long time I was using Blue Star Matrix on my PC downstairs, because the best ones, I use a Mac, but the best are for PCs, and I'd been using it for a long time, and things started to not seem right to me, and I'd, you know, check it against either Astro or on my phone. And what I had done inadvertently was upgraded my computer downstairs to Windows 10, which made it incompatible with the Blue Star Matrix program. And then it was really slow. And then I asked my son when he was home to just speed it up. And then, of course, the Blue Star Matrix program, it was like the computer ate my program. So I got solar fire. But, you know, they're not, you really have to use your common sense and double check. Even when you did it by hand, those whole tables of houses, Indiana had something like 200 different time zones. So it was like shepherdizing a law case. You had to have the latest updated book, and the computer programs are very good at keeping everything current and updated, but you also have to understand your computer and understand the limitations of computers. And you also don't notice where the stationary planets are sometimes if you just do it by.
Well, I absolutely always, I have my American ephemeris for the first half of this century and last century. They're there. I refer to them all the time.
Yep, I got them all.
You can get I bought the first half on the grounds that I won't be alive in the second half, so I'm too mean to buy the second half.
Well, I wish they'd reissued that one they had in hardback, because it was the most beautiful shade of blue.
Yeah.
It was like a holy book, and they're never probably going to go back. That's a loss. They're never going to come back to hardback ephemerises. I mean, these got really beat up looking when I used them, and that hardback was my favorite book.
Do you know what, Peg? I'm just loving all this worship we're doing here, ritual and worship centered around the whole business of generating a horoscope. It's wonderful. And I agree with you. I think you have to be very careful. I always used IO software, which I loved and found very reliable. I also have time passages on my app. And I've always done various double checks. Occasionally you get it wrong, but very often what happens is that when you turn up with the wrong charts, maybe somebody's given you the wrong time, you go, this person doesn't fit this chart. And I think we've had experiences of that happening and having to sort that one out.
I have Moon in Virgo. Maybe it's on your ascendant.
Well, quite something like that. So I hope that answers that particular issue and also celebrates the joys of ephemerides, old books, and the advantages of computerized astrology as well.
Now we have got a question about house systems. They've written a whole, you know what? There's a whole huge piece in this book about house systems, which is just a can of worms, isn't it?
Do you know what? Who is it who's asking this? Charmaine. Charmaine. Why don't you where's Charmaine? Do you want to put your hand up? Is that you? Tell you what, I'm going to do a bit of shameless selling here. Why don't you go and buy my book, and then you can read the whole section on house systems.
It's so complex. It's too complex to even.
There, do you know, shall I give you a couple of sentences on what I think, which will probably be heretical, and various people who are completely devoted to their house system who want to jump up and down on my head. I just think that if there are strong themes in a person's life, these strong themes will show up in the horoscope no matter what house system you use.
Yeah.
I did some research with some of my students, and you can read about that in the book. And that was what came through the research.
Yeah, I agree with that. And so I find that, I've used Placidus, or I've used Koch or Coke, however it's pronounced, or whatever, that I flip back and forth between the two sometimes. And you know what? You can still do a great reading.
Absolutely.
But I see we're kind of coming to the end of an hour, and I want to go slightly over the hour because I wanted to ask you my last sort of theme that I'm really interested in, that you write about in the book, variously, you do end on this, is the future. And because we've talked about the past of astrology and the past, and what do you think about the future? What's your feeling now that we're in this era? You're in an interesting year. We're in this airy year and things are opening up. And you wrote a very nice piece about Greta Thunberg and Mary Shelley.
Yeah. How on earth do you answer a question like that in the last few minutes? But as far as Greta and Mary Shelley are concerned, you may wonder why I made a connection between the two, but these are two very young women. Mary Shelley conceived Frankenstein when she was on her first nodal return, and she presented it to the world just a couple of years afterwards. And she wrote a book basically which was saying, look, you pursue scientific ends without ethics and without compassion and without fairness and justice at your peril. And we have got to, and she put that message out really at about the beginning of the 200-year period where the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions were traveling through the earth element. And at the end of our traverse through the earth element appeared another amazing young woman, Greta Thunberg. And it's as though she took the warning that Mary Shelley had issued at the very beginning of this 200-year period and kind of caught it, like a battle or like a torch, and is moving into the future. And what she's telling us is, we have not looked after our planet. We have raped and exploited it. During this whole material era, we have caused huge amounts of damage. We're in a state of peril, and we have to work out how we're going to fix it. And I just found it astonishing. The links between these two women's charts, if you buy the book, you will look at these charts and be absolutely astonished, even to the extent that Mary, you know how people's charts go on and on and on even after they've left this world. Mary Shelley's progressed moon on the winter solstice of last year, which is when the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions finally settled down to be in air for the next 200 years, Mary Shelley's moon was at 26 degrees of, I think it's Aquarius, bang on a key point of Greta Thunberg's horoscope, and bang on a key point of the chart of the moment. I can't exactly remember them just now, so I'm not going to quote them wrongly, but it was an astounding link, absolutely astounding, and it just blew my mind. And we're now in a different era. We're in an air era. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, which are seen as the kind of defining energies of any particular era, are going to be moving through the air element for the next 200 years or so. Our whole culture was upended by an airborne virus, and our whole culture has now moved to a very considerable degree into air. We're all on Zoom. We're all using social media. We are in the process of moving into a completely different era. Now, some people think it's the age of Aquarius, but I go along with Nick Campion, who's collected, Dr. Nick Campion, the astrological historian and very well-respected astrologer, who has collected something like 186 different possible starts to the age of Aquarius from somewhere in the 18th century to somewhere in the 21st century. So it's basically a big metaphor. But the fact of the matter is that that key defining set of planets is going through Aquarius and through air. Then Pluto is moving into Aquarius in 2024, when America completes her Pluto return of 248 years. So no wonder America is in turmoil just now. So we really are, I mean, what encourages me about the dark times we're living in is that every single time throughout history, when there's been a great shift from one era to another, there's been darkness, difficulty, and turmoil. But if we don't periodically return to chaos after the old order is spent, then we're not going to get anything new emerging. And there's a whole new generation of people with new values, new attitudes, new ideas, who have much more respect for the planet, who are much less materialistic, who are open to subjects like astrology. And let's hope that they can carry us forward into a future which is rooted in a greater degree of humility than the 200 years period that we've just passed through, because we need a bit of humility and a bit of acceptance that perhaps instead of projecting everything outwards onto other people, we need to look at where we are. In other words, to come back to one of Jung's most famous dicta, if there's something that, I'm paraphrasing this, but what he said was, if there's something wrong with the world, there's something wrong with my country. If there's something wrong with my country, there's something wrong with our culture. If there's something wrong with our culture, there's something wrong with my family. If there's something wrong with my family, there's something wrong with me. I need to start with me and work out my way outwards if I'm going to change anything. And I like that. I try to work from that premise.
Thank you. I think that, does anybody
was that an adequate response to your ginormous question?
I like big questions.
Yes, I like big answers.
Yeah, well, thank you. And yeah, and that's sort of it for this evening. I am going to, like I said, I'm going to try and publish this, but I'm going to run it past Anne first. So therefore I might not publish it if she hates it. But I will publish this recording and you'll be able to look at it again. And so we can share it.
Well, I really appreciate you all turning up, and I hope you've got something out of this session. And of course, being a writer, I really hope you'll rush off out and buy copies of my book. And if you do, a small review on Amazon, just 3 lines, would be so appreciated.
It's really, really, really important and useful to do that, actually, folks. To do the Amazon review is incredibly helpful. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Night.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.